When most people think of Triple H, they think of the sledgehammer, the pedigree, the water-spitting badass who had a cool entrance theme. But behind the character lies one of the most selfish, cunning, backstabbing, and opportunistic politicians in WWE history. From carrying Shawn Michaels' bags in the 90s to sitting in Vince McMahon's chair 30 years later, Paul Levesque has always known exactly which door to walk through and exactly whose coattails to grab on the way there. This is the story of a man who never met a hot angle he didn't want a piece of, never met a rising star he didn't want to overshadow, and never quite figured out that the most powerful thing he could do was simply let other people shine. From the Kliq to the Authority, from NXT to Raw on Netflix, this is the story of the most selfish man in WWE history. When Paul Levesque first showed up in WWE, he wasn't particularly special. He was a decent worker and had a good physique, but, as everyone from Bret Hart to The Undertaker has said, nothing about him screamed future main eventer. He was supposed to be a mid-card player who would be forgotten sooner or later. However, young Paul was smart enough to recognize where the real power was. Shawn Michaels was the hottest thing in wrestling in the mid-90s. He was charismatic, gifted in the ring, and the kind of guy who could make any match feel like a big deal. And Triple H latched onto him immediately. The Kliq, consisting primarily of HBK, Triple H, Diesel, and Razor Ramon, ran WWE backstage during that era. They decided who got pushed, who got buried, and who stayed in catering. And Triple H, the youngest and least established of the group, was essentially their errand boy, carrying bags, running errands, doing whatever it took to stay in their good graces. Because being in that circle meant protection, it meant opportunity, it meant your career moved forward regardless of whether the fans were actually behind you. The most revealing moment of this entire period came at Madison Square Garden in 1996 with the curtain call. When Diesel and Razor Ramon were leaving for WCW, the Kliq broke kayfabe in the middle of the ring to say goodbye. It was a massive violation of wrestling's unwritten rules, and Vince was furious. But here's the thing. HBK was the champion and untouchable. Diesel and Razor were already gone. Triple H was the only one left who could actually be punished, so he took the fall. His King of the Ring push that year was scrapped, and for a few months it looked like his ceiling had been set. But here's the thing about having powerful friends. The punishment never lasts long. Shawn went to bat for him, the heat cooled down, and Triple H was right back on track, winning the tournament the following year. The whole episode actually tells you everything about how he operated. He benefited from the Kliq's power for years, and the one time it cost him something, someone else stepped in to fix it. That's a safety net most wrestlers never had. But the biggest evidence of Triple H's opportunistic nature during this time was how his relationship with Chyna ended. Whatever you think about their relationship, the professional reality is that Chyna was one of the most unique and over acts of that period who made Triple H look more dangerous just by standing next to him. They were a package deal for years, but somewhere along the way, Triple H started spending time with the boss's daughter, Stephanie McMahon, the woman who would eventually control WWE's creative direction alongside her father. Chyna, by multiple accounts, was never told directly what was happening. She found out about the relationship the way nobody wants to find out about anything. And professionally, the timing was brutal. She was quietly phased out while Triple H's position in the company became completely untouchable overnight. You can call it a love story if you want, but the professional math is pretty straightforward. Triple H went from a guy who needed Shawn Michaels to protect his spot to a guy who would one day literally own a piece of the company he worked for. And it happened right around the same time he started dating the boss's daughter, and his run in the main event began. Now, I'm not saying Triple H wasn't a good wrestler, but there's a massive difference between being a good wrestler and being good at making yourself look like a good wrestler. And Triple H has always been significantly better at the second thing than the first. His reign of terror, which came in the early 2000s, was the biggest proof of this fact. By 2002, WWE had a serious problem. The Rock had gone to Hollywood. Stone Cold's body had finally given out, and the company desperately needed someone to step up and carry Raw as its top guy. What they got instead was Triple H deciding the job was already his and torturing fans with the most suffocating title reign in WWE history. The game held the World Heavyweight Championship for the better part of 3 years, dropping it occasionally before winning it back almost immediately. The Raw roster during this period was genuinely loaded. Booker T, Rob Van Dam, Kane, Shawn Michaels, Chris Jericho, guys who were over with the crowd and deserved a shot as the face of the brand. Instead, they all got fed into the Triple H machine and spat out the other side. The Booker T situation at WrestleMania 19 still makes people furious to this day. In the build-up to their match, Triple H cut a promo that went well beyond normal heel work. Then WrestleMania came, and after weeks of building Booker as a babyface, Triple H won clean in the middle of the ring. It took Booker T over 3 years to reach the main event scene after that burial. RVD was another example. He was over as anybody on that roster, and crowds were losing their minds for him every single week. But even Van Dam got a taste of the game's golden shovel. Then there's the Kane situation. For years, WWE built Kane up as an unstoppable monster. The night he won the Intercontinental Championship felt like the beginning of a serious solo run. But then, Triple H did the whole Katie Vick thing, beat him on Raw, and that was essentially the end of Kane as a serious main event threat. The Reign of Terror had a clean narrative. Triple H was the top heel, the roster was below him, that was the story. But what's harder to defend is the pattern that continued long after that era ended. Because Triple H's ego and selfish nature didn't take a backseat even after he stopped being an active competitor. The summer of Punk in 2011 was the most exciting thing to happen in WWE in years. Punk grabbed a live microphone and said things about the McMahon family and Triple H that felt real because they probably were. It was the hottest thing in wrestling for weeks, and then Triple H inserted himself into the storyline. What started as Punk versus Vince became Punk versus Triple H, and the whole thing slowly deflated with a Kevin Nash involvement that made no sense. The most anti-establishment angle WWE had done in a decade ended with a sledgehammer ladder match between two Kliq members. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Daniel Bryan situation in 2013 followed the same script. Bryan was the most over babyface in the company, and the crowds were hijacking shows to cheer for him with the yes chants. Triple H saw his opportunity once again, inserted himself into the story, gave himself a grand entrance at WrestleMania 30, and the feud took a much longer, messier road where Triple H kept himself relevant in the narrative long past the point the story needed him. The Shield feud followed the same logic. When Triple H saw Rollins, Reigns, and Ambrose get the loudest reactions on the roster, he reformed Evolution and inserted himself into a feud with the Hounds of Justice. This same pattern haunted the main event scene from 2003 to 2013. Be it John Cena in 2006, CM Punk in 2011, Daniel Bryan in 2013, The Shield in 2014. Every time there was a hot act in the WWE, Triple H had to stick his nose and insert himself in the story. And then came NXT Black and Gold, which is supposed to be the game's redemption arc, but is that the complete reality though? When Triple H took over NXT, the wrestling world did not know what to expect. This was a man whose main roster tenure had been defined by protecting his spot and burying anyone who got too close to his level. But NXT Black and Gold was different. Legit 5-star classics, consistent storytelling, a roster full of hungry and talented wrestlers. For a few years, it was the best weekly wrestling show in the world. But here's the question nobody wants to sit with. How much of that was actually Triple H? Because many fans will argue that Dusty Rhodes was the soul of that NXT. The way talent was developed, the way promos were taught, the way characters were built from the ground up, that was Dusty's fingerprints all over it. The man poured everything he had left into that performance center and developed FCW into NXT. When Dusty died in 2015, the wrestlers who trained under him were openly devastated in a way that went beyond professional respect. He meant something to those people personally. After Dusty's death, Triple H took what he'd already built and got the credit. He was the executive, his name was on the product, and when the wrestling press wanted someone to interview about NXT's success, he was the one sitting across the table. That's how corporate structures work, and Triple H understood that better than anyone. The Black and Gold era also benefited enormously from the indie wrestling boom that saw established stars like Adam Cole, Ricochet, Gargano, Ciampa, Aleister Black, Nakamura, and others arriving on NXT. Ring of Honor had been building talent for years. Triple H was smart enough to let talented people do what they were good at. Whether that counts as vision or just being at the right place at the right time, I'll let you decide. When Vince left and Triple H took over main roster creative in 2022, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive thanks to the goodwill from NXT Black and Gold. And for a while, he delivered. Stars who were released returned, the production quality changed, stories had depth, and certain acts that had been mishandled for years finally started getting opportunities. But then something started shifting, and it's been shifting steadily ever since. The main roster booking after WrestleMania 40 has been genuinely difficult to defend. Feuds started and stopped without resolution. Stars like LA Knight, who had real momentum, cooled off because of horrible booking. John Cena's retirement tour was a disappointment. And through all of it, Triple H kept showing up on television. Not as a character with a defined role, but as himself, the chief content officer, the man behind the curtain who kept stepping in front of the curtain. Title reveals that should have been about the wrestlers became about Triple H presenting the title. Hot segments like Obafemi and Brock Lesnar's contract signing that the crowd was already invested in suddenly had Triple H inserted into them for no clear reason. Many fans even argued that the only reason WrestleMania 40 was a success was that Vince had already put the puzzle pieces in place with Cody's return and the bloodline story that had been building for years. Triple H just added the finishing touches and took the credit. Through all of this, Triple H has made a point of saying publicly that online discourse doesn't drive his decisions, that he books for the live crowd and the casual viewer, that the hardcore internet base represents a small percentage of the actual audience. But at the same time, he can't seem to stop talking about the internet fans. Every few months, there's another comment about what the internet thinks, another acknowledgement of the online reaction to a decision, another explanation directed squarely at the people he claims don't matter to him. If the internet fans truly didn't factor into his thinking, he would never mention them. The fact that he keeps bringing them up suggests they're living rent-free in his head while he simultaneously dismisses them publicly. At the same time, Triple H can't help but insert his face everywhere from DVD covers to posters to the end credits of Raw, and even positioning himself as the main character of the show on WWE Unreal. When WWE releases promotional material and the chief content officer's face is on it alongside the active wrestlers, something has gone wrong with the priorities. The audience is supposed to be looking at the wrestlers. The executive should be invisible. There's a version of Triple H's legacy as a creative figure that's still being written, and it's possible the main roster struggles are a transitional phase rather than a permanent condition. But the pattern that defined his in-ring career keeps showing up in his executive career. The inability to fully get out of his own way. The compulsion to remain the central figure in whatever room he's standing in. The wrestlers who work for him now are dealing with the same guy that frustrated an entire generation of performers before them. Triple H didn't need to be the bag boy forever. He figured out the game early and he played it better than almost anyone. But there's a real question about whether the guy who spent 30 years making sure nobody overshadowed him is actually capable of doing the one job his current role requires: getting out of the way. Because the King of Kings didn't just learn how to take over a kingdom, he got very good at making sure nobody else could claim the throne.